So 3 years ago, I started a garden. Nothing too big or fancy, just like a 20 by 40 foot piece of our property. There was no grass growing there. It had been a garden it looked like before, and I thought, I can't get grass to grow. It looks like an eyesore. I might as well turn it into a garden. So that's what I did. And the first year, I had no idea what I was doing. You're like, well, you just plant things, and they grow, and then you harvest them. It's not that complicated. But someone was like, you need to go test your soil. And then I knew that there were different times to plant different things. And so I just kind of threw a Hail Mary, if you will, just started doing stuff, and then had a really, really good year. So the next year, the summer of 2019, we doubled the size of our garden. And I planted all kinds of stuff in it. And that went really, really well. Well, then this year, summer 2020, we're in the middle of quarantine, and I'm like, I'm going to have a ton of time, and my kids aren't playing sports. I'm not coaching anything. Like evenings, I can just go out, get my hands dirty, and just get this thing really dialed in. And I was excited about it because I love being outside. I love the smell of fresh air. I love to work with my hands. And what I do now is a lot of office type stuff, but I was so excited about doing it. And this year was the absolute worst year for my garden. And I don't know why. Well, I kind of know some of the reasons why. Number one, the seed that we planted for our corn, half of it didn't come up. The half that did come up got to be this tall, and then it just all died. Well, that happened to a couple of guys who also bought seed there. So that's not completely on me. At least that's what I'm telling myself to make me feel better. It's not completely on me. The beans, I think I was just so anxious and so excited. I think I planted the beans a little bit too early. And of the 8 rows that I planted, I had 1 bean plant come up. And out of spite, I murdered that plant. I was so angry at it. I just took the hoe and just chopped its little head off, and that was it. Yes, that's right, Pastor Doug, anger issues, I guess. Then the cucumbers and the squash had this weird silver bug on them, and it started to eat, and I'm pulling them off, and I don't want to spray too much on them because I'm going to be eating these things, and it's like they just went in and tore everything up. The carrots that I planted, of course, you got to plant those early. You barely plant those. You can't plant them deep, like 1/8 of an inch or something like that, 1/4 inch. And the day after I planted them, I had a huge monsoon come in and washed all my carrot plants away. And I'm just like, man, I can't, what in the world is going on here? And then I'm wondering, do I need to, I've had 2 good years, and this year nothing was really growing or taking off. Maybe I do need to test my soil. Maybe I need to put in compost or fertilizer and add lime. People talk about that, but you can do too much of that. And just think about all the conditions that have to be right. The first year, I think I got really, really lucky. It's like the first time I ever went deer hunting, I killed a deer. The first time I ever went turkey hunting, I killed a turkey. And then I realized it just doesn't happen like that. Conditions have to be right, and there is, I don't want to say it's luck, but there are factors outside of your control that have to be right in order for things to happen the way they're supposed to happen. The worst part of this entire story is that behind my barn, where we had the chicken coop, we had thrown tomatoes and we had thrown pumpkins in and let the chickens eat. Well, behind the barn, I guess the soil really got fertilized well. And I had beautiful tomato plants back there and beautiful I had 25 pumpkins that I picked off of these pumpkin plants, and that's what we used for the pumpkin carving contest for youth. I'm like, I have so many pumpkins. What am I going to do with all of these? It was spiteful. The soil was getting back at me and laughing in my face. You think you know what you're doing. You know nothing. And there were weeds back there like crazy, and I had sprayed, and as I was spraying, I'm like, wait a minute, that's pumpkin. And those are tomatoes, and I don't want to spray those. And that's where I got all my harvest from, was behind my barn where I did absolutely nothing. Because conditions have to be right in order for things to be able to grow. And that's not just true about, plants in a garden. That's true for business as well. And they talk about when to start a business, how to start a business, what type of economy that looks like. And this is a terrible time to start a business if you're thinking about it because of all the stuff that's going on. And these past several months have been really, really terrible. And we talk about the economy and launching a new business or growing a business or hiring somebody. Conditions have to be right. And the thing about the conditions is there's a lot outside of our control. Well, as we think about continuing our series in the book of Philippians today, we're going to talk about the conditions that have to happen or have to be right in order for the gospel to spread. the conditions that have to be present in order for the kingdom to be firmly established. This is what Paul is going to kind of talk about today in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through the first half of verse 18. So if you've got your Bible or a Bible app, I want to encourage you to go ahead and turn there. And the thing about this series, we're just walking basically verse by verse through the book of Philippians. And you remember, as Paul kind of opens up his letter, he's in prison. He's writing under Roman house arrest, and he's got some freedoms that he can have visitors, and he can write letters, and he can send messages out and things like that. But he's still in prison, and he's still in chains. So it's not the ideal setting or environment. And it appears that the church in Philippi, they're worried about Paul. They're worried about the work that he was doing. And in this second section of the book of Philippians, he wants to encourage them that even though there are bad things that have happened to him, God is using them for good. So in this passage, he's going to talk about two issues. Number one, that he's in prison, he's in chains. And then he's going to talk about a couple of things that have happened as a result of that. And then he's going to talk about some people who they're trying to stir up trouble for them. For the sake of the discussion today, I'm going to call them haters. And if Taylor Swift has taught us anything, it's that haters are going to hate, right? You never thought you'd come to church and hear the pastor quote Taylor Swift, of all people. But haters are going to hate, and they're going to stir up trouble. And Paul says, well, because that's happened, there's actually good as a result as well. So, Philippians chapter 1, hopefully you got your Bible or Bible app. Verse 12, here we go. He says, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Now, it's interesting that Greek word for advance means a pioneer or a trailblazer. We think of people who lived like in the late early 1800s, who were heading west, which at the time was like, what we would call West Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky, and they're kind of establishing new farms, new communities, new village. They're going into uncharted territory, and they're cutting paths and they're cutting trails, and eventually they're used over and over again. They become actual roads on down the line. They would have thought of men that would go before the army and blaze a trail so that the chariots and the thousands of men marching would have a place to go. Because as Rome would conquer different nations or different cities, they're going to places that there wasn't necessarily, okay, we're going to take 64 and then we're going to hop on. They couldn't do that. It was uncharted territory. So the advancement that Paul wants his readers to think of is the gospel is going places that it would not have gone unless Paul was in prison. The gospel is able to spread to completely new places that it would not have spread to if Paul had not been arrested and been in prison literally for years as he's writing this. In verse 13, he talks about what that looks like in one instance. He says that as a result of my chains, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. So he says the whole palace guard. This would have made up a group of soldiers, numbering somewhere in the ballpark of 15,000. They were the only soldiers allowed in Rome, and they did not leave the region of Italy. They stayed. So if there was a campaign, we're going to go take over this area or take over this nation, the whole palace guard, the elite secret service is another way to think of them, they would stay in Rome. They were highly paid so that they would be less likely to join a coup or an overthrow of the emperor. And their job was just to be in Rome and keep civil unrest down. One of the jobs that they had as well was they worked in the prisons. And every 4 hours, the Apostle Paul would have had a new guard come in. So every 4 hours, Paul is introduced to a new guard, which is like throwing, meat to a hungry lion. It's like we've got a guy that Paul's never met, who's never heard the gospel, and guess what 4 hours with Paul is going to look like? And the guy can't leave. That's the thing. It's not like he can be like, all right, you're getting on my nerves, dude. I'm going to go for a walk. He can't leave. He's there to guard Paul. So Paul's there sharing the faith. Paul is teaching about Jesus. And so for a soldier every 4 hours, that's 6 soldiers a day that Paul's able to chat with and communicate with. And so of the 15,000, I don't know how many would have been in Paul's cell, if they would have gone on a rotation and every Monday at noon the same guy walked in or what. But just think that it's probably hundreds, if not that, thousands of soldiers that Paul would have been able to interact with throughout his time in Roman imprisonment as he's awaiting trial before Caesar. And the crazy thing is, at the end of this letter, Paul sends greetings to the Philippian Christian from all the Christians that belong to Caesar's household. And the thing is that the Roman soldiers that are in Paul's jail cell and guarding him, every 4 hours a new guy comes in, they were considered a part of Caesar's household because their income, their salaries were paid from Caesar's personal treasury. So they were considered members of his household because they were technically under his care. And so that's like it's not like Paul's come out and said it, but it's obvious that some of these men who are guarding him end up becoming Jesus followers. And they're able to take the gospel to, some of their family members, to some of their fellow soldiers. And Paul's saying, look, if I wasn't in prison, these guys don't have a relationship with Jesus. I have a unique opportunity to preach the gospel to a group of really tough elite soldiers that normally I wouldn't have had the opportunity to preach to. So that's the first trail that gets blazed that would not have been able to had Paul not been imprisoned. The second one is what happens with all of the people that he's influenced throughout his ministry. So verse 14, Paul says, "And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear." And this seems a little counterintuitive. It's like, wait a minute, Paul gets arrested and he's thrown in prison. The other Christians see, Paul's preaching about Jesus, now he's arrested and in prison. You would think they would say, maybe we should keep our mouths shut so we don't have to go to prison too. That's not what they say. They become more emboldened and more courageous and begin to preach the gospel with more fervor. It could be because they hey, Paul, he's kind of our A player. He's in prison. Who's going to preach? And they would say, I'm going to go preach. And somebody else say, I would go preach. And it didn't give us a number. It just says that most of the brothers and sisters. Is that a dozen? Is that 100? Well, regardless of the number, you have men and women who are kind of emboldened and become more passionate and feel a personal challenge and conviction. So instead of Paul, which is one man, going around and preaching and spreading the gospel, you have potentially dozens going around and preaching and teaching the gospel, which means the impact and the spread of the gospel, it is exponentially higher because it's not just one guy going and doing it, it's dozens of guys going and doing it in all different directions, impacting families that the Apostle Paul wouldn't have the opportunity to impact. So Paul says, I'm preaching to these rough, tough Secret Service guys. Nobody gets to be in their presence and chat with them, but I get to. And there are people going around picking up the slack and preaching, whereas I'm not able to go. Those are two things that he mentions. And I'll mention a third that he doesn't specifically throw out there, but is true. It's that Paul, because he has more time on his hands, he's not traveling around and preaching, he's kind of just sitting there, he begins to write letters. And the reason that's significant is because the letters that he writes to different churches become books or letters that we have in our New Testament. And of the 27 New Testament books, 13 were written by the Apostle Paul when he was forced to slow down and didn't have a whole lot else to do. And he's like, I'm going to write and check up on all these churches and see how they're doing. And 2,000 years later, we're still able to go to those letters and unpack those passages to learn more about who God is, how he loves us, and how we're supposed to live in light of all of that. If this imprisonment doesn't happen, we don't have Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and we don't have Philippians and Ephesians and all these letters that Paul wrote. And so this blessing is able to come to us because Paul had to slow down. It's like what we hopefully did during quarantine. You have more time on your hands, and hopefully you can be mindful of excelling and advancing in terms of physically, spiritually. Hopefully you played games as a family. Hopefully you didn't use your quarantine time to binge watch your favorite show for 18 hours straight on Netflix or Hulu or whatever. Hopefully you're like, man, we can slow down, we can catch our breath, and we can go plant stuff in the garden that's not going to grow. What a great time we're going to have, right? But hopefully you did something useful and productive. Paul, in prison, does something useful and productive. So though he's in chains and he's in prison, these three things end up happening that would not have been able to happen had he not been in prison. And then he shifts and starts talking about those who are going out and preaching the gospel. And not all of them were doing so because they love Jesus and they love what Paul was doing and they want to see the gospel advance. Some of them were trying to stir up trouble for Paul and take away some of his clout or some of his popularity or some of his influence on these churches. They're trying to rob him of that. In fact, he says in the next verse, verse 15, "It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains." Now, what they were saying about Paul and how it all played out, he's not really clear on. There's some ambiguity as to what's going on, but here's what we notice from the rest of the letter, as well as reading other letters that Paul wrote. These individuals, how many of them there were, they were not saying things that were untrue about Jesus or untrue about the gospel. They weren't spreading false teaching. The things that they were saying were accurate, but they were doing so with the wrong motive. They wanted to take shots at the Apostle Paul. For whatever reason, there was a tension and there was a rivalry between Paul and these individuals. And now that Paul's in prison, they're using that vacuum as an opportunity to go out and make a name for themselves now that Paul is kind of out of the picture. Now, I don't know if you've ever had people say bad things about you that weren't true or start rumors about you. And it's like, if I hear something, I'm like, I want to make sure that they know what's true and I want to make things right. I don't want people saying things about me that aren't true or throwing me under the bus or whatever. Like, I get frustrated and I get angry, and I'm sure that you probably fit in that category. So Paul, they were trying to stir up trouble for him while he was in prison. What is his response? He says in verse 18, "What does it matter? Who cares? I don't care. You shouldn't care. What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice." Paul's like, I don't care what they say about me. I don't care if they try to stir up trouble for me. My big thing is the gospel advancing. And if Jesus is being preached, I don't care the source, and I don't care what the motivation was. I just want to see Jesus proclaimed throughout the entire world. And if Jesus is being proclaimed, I'm just going to praise God because of that. Now, to me, once again, this seems a little counterintuitive. And Paul is not saying, by the way, that in your life, if somebody where you work says that you stole money, that you should just go, well, hey, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to be like Paul and just kind of keep my mouth shut. No, you're allowed to defend yourself. And if somebody goes public with something, you're allowed to go public to defend yourself. But for here, Paul's like, I can't control that. I can't get them to stop. Therefore, I can't worry about it. They're saying things about Jesus and preaching things about Jesus that's true. And at the end of the day, that's really all I care about. And he's not saying, by the way, that preachers who preach with a wrong motive are right in their standing before God, because that's not true. We're told that teachers and those who present Scripture, they're judged more strictly, both in the content that they deliver as well as the motivation that they use to preach. He's not letting these guys off the hook. He's just saying, I can't do anything about it. You guys can't do anything about it. The things they're saying about Jesus, it's biblically accurate. It's not false teaching. It's not heresy. He's going to address that in chapter 3 of this letter. The stuff they're saying is true. He doesn't really care about the motivation behind it. He just wants to see Jesus and his name spread all throughout the Roman Empire, and even by extension, parts of the world that they aren't even aware of. That was Paul's deepest desire. And here's the thing. that needs to be our deepest desire as well. The most important thing for us as Jesus followers is the gospel spreading and the establishment of his kingdom. That when Jesus prays in the Sermon on the Mount, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Like that is our prayer. We don't pray for our name or for our kingdom to be protected. We pray for his to advance. And if the gospel is able to advance, and if it's able to go into new territories that it wasn't able to go in because of hardship or persecution or whatever, we should have the same mindset as the Apostle Paul. We should rejoice that God's name is glorified even in the midst of chaos and difficulty. And so you want to identify, okay, a garden, here are the conditions for the gardener. A business, here's the condition for a business to grow. What are the conditions for the gospel to spread, for the kingdom to be more firmly established? Well, the big idea for today is that there is no ideal environment when it comes to the gospel spreading. It can just spread. And it's going to spread. Like Jesus sits on his throne. And sometimes you and I are so worried about all these different things that are happening around us, happening in our world, happening in our nation, happening in our community. We're like, and like for me, I'll just use myself as an example. During the pandemic, we had 10 weeks of no church, and I'm like, boy, this isn't good, and we're trying to do stuff online, and we're trying to do other teaching, but my goodness, what's going to happen, and how are people going to continue to grow, and are people going to check out? And I was, worried, and I was praying, and God's like, hey, Home Slice, I got this. The stars don't have to align in order for the gospel to spread. You're thinking that, oh no, this is bad and what's going to happen? Like, there have been a lot worse that's happened in the history of the world, and the gospel has taken off. You don't have to figure everything out. Just be obedient and serve. And I may have to think outside the box. And like as we get to a new normal, what that ever looks like, we may do things differently than we've ever done them before as we try to adjust to kind of culture and the times and things like that. But like, God is not by any means worried that the gospel's not going to spread and the kingdom's not going to be established. Like, God's not worried about his church with a capital C now, the bride of Christ. He's not worried about his church. He's like, boy, you guys should have been around 2,000 years ago in Rome if you think this is bad. Like Paul, who was the Billy Graham of his day, is in jail. Imagine if like somebody broke in and arrested me. That would be bad. I'd be like, I'd rather have the pandemic than go to jail for years upon years. And yet, there are Christians in the world right now, and they're not worshiping right now probably because they're on the other side of the world. And it's 11:13 at night there as opposed to in the middle of the day. But they're worried. They're worried that someone's going to break in and arrest their pastor and beat their pastor and murder their pastor and then do things to them as Jesus followers as well. And yet the gospel spreads in those areas like crazy. In fact, here in the last few weeks, I was talking to one of my good friends. He's a part of my accountability group. He's actually in India. And so we do our accountability time via Skype. And part of his responsibility is he is in charge of a Bible college in India. And it looks different than we do Bible college here. And it's not only theology, but heavy on the practical of how you plant churches. And they're planting churches in like super urban areas where there are just thousands of people living in a very small area. And then they have to teach people how to plant churches like in tribal third world country type areas. And so they do everything, and they kind of cater the curriculum that's specific to whoever it is that's coming. So they normally have on their compound a couple of hundred pastors in training every semester for this 2-year program so they can go out and plant churches and house churches. And so we were asking him about that, like, have you been able to have people on your campus? And he's like, oh no, the government has shut that down. There's no way. And I said, so how are you guys doing? And are you guys having students? He's like, oh yeah, we have students. I'm like, oh, how many? He's like 4,000. But you have 4,000 students? He's like, yeah, well, once we knew the quarantine, we knew we probably weren't going to get back together, we did everything online. We've been talking about that, but it's like we have to do this now. And so we worked really hard. Everything's online. You got a lot of guys who are coming from like deep tribal areas. They don't have internet. They don't have cell phone coverage, but they're able to get to a place or get to a church that has access to technology. And so now you've got like churches that are hosting for us, different groups of students that are coming in. So you've got, 50 here and 100 over there. And he's like, we've got like 4,000. And I'm like, what do you think the attrition's going to be? Like, how many are you going to graduate? He said, well, we're planning on probably somewhere in the ballpark of half. Well, still, 2,000 compared to like 200, that's something like 10 times more. I'm not a math wizard, but that's somewhere, right? Like 10 times the impact. And if those guys go out and plant like 2 or 3 house churches within the next 2 years, imagine that the impact that that's going to have. He's like, so yeah, it's been terrible, and the pandemic and the quarantine stuff has been absolutely awful, but it has advanced the gospel. It's blazed a new trail that we didn't even think was possible and know could even happen. And I was like, that's pretty typical of God. Like, something happens and we think, oh no, what are we going to do? How's this going to work? How are we going to reach people? Or how are we going to grow our church or get students to this Bible college or whatever it is we're thinking? And exponentially, more people are going to be impacted because of the negative that has come in to their culture and really our entire world. And I would say that isn't just true of India or just true of persecuted Christians in China or in Cuba. I was reading in Cuba whenever things were really hostile there. When things turned bad, the Methodist Church, I was just reading an article about it. The Methodist Church had like 6,000 members. And then like within 5 years of all the chaos and all the turmoil and the communism coming and destroying the country, the Methodist Church membership went from 6,000 to 50,000 in the matter of like 3 or 4 years. Because the gospel is just going to spread. God doesn't need the stars to align and, oh no, what am I going to do about this? And get some angels and have a conference call and they're going to start brainstorming. Like, God's like, no, I know exactly what I'm going to do with this negative situation. I'm going to turn it out for good. This is what Paul's trying to remind the Philippian church of. Though he's in chains, look at what the gospel is doing in spite of the negative. And that's true of our world as well. In fact, I was thinking about this, and I'm going to get political on you for 2 weeks in a row, okay? Because here's one thing that I notice about Tuesday's election. There are very few people who are like, I don't think it really matters. I don't think, Biden or Trump, I don't think anything's going to really change. The majority of the people that I know are preparing for the sky to fall based on the results of the election. And I got to be honest with you. I've been thinking and I've been praying and I'm like, okay, what's going to happen and how's it going to play out? And thank God that I live in the middle of cornfields and not in St. Louis where I used to live, because things are probably going to get really bad over there either way. And, like the coyotes probably aren't going to be any different than they are now, so I'm probably safe. I'm probably okay. Unless they start voting too, which I don't know what's going to happen then, but I'm probably going to be fine in the middle of cornfields. And so people are just losing their minds. And you can see it on the news and you can see it on Facebook and Instagram. People are absolutely oh no, if Trump gets reelected, oh no, if Biden gets elected, And I want us all to say, you know what? Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We don't need for one person to get elected for everything to be made right. In fact, you probably have your opinion. I do too. We're not going to talk about that because there's no win in that. But you probably have your opinion. Who needs to get elected for things to get fixed or things to be right or things to continue on the right path? These are fallible human beings. And if I'm completely honest, when you watch the debates, I'm like, I don't know that these are the two smartest people that we could get into a room and then run against each other. We live in the greatest country on earth. And we got, my goodness, we are in trouble no matter what happens. But you know what? Jesus is still on his throne. And I'm worried, what does that mean for the church, and how are we going to continue to move forward, and what happens if these different things get unveiled and get unfolded? It's oh no. God's like, dude, have you heard of the Emperor Nero? Do you know what he did? Have you heard of Vespasian and all these guys who murdered thousands to hundreds of thousands of Christians, like you think that what you're going to go through is bad? If we do, we don't know history. So God's got it, man. And now listen, when I say God's got it, I am not saying everything's going to be hunky-dory, because Paul's like, God's got it while he's in prison in chains. The key is, will the gospel spread, and will the things that we are about and passionate about in life, will those things echo into eternity? Will those things last forever? And if it's Jesus movement stuff, the answer is yes. And the stuff that lasts forever, if we're passionate about it and we partner with God to advance it, you and I, we will be amazed at what God is able to do through it all. So just take a deep breath. And Tuesday, whatever happens, if you've got a bunker and things go south, just let me know. I may come stay with you. I'll bring some of my food and my ammo. We'll be set, okay? But whatever happens, as chaotic as things may go, and look, I'm not saying I don't think they're going to get chaotic. I think it's going to be complete and total pandemonium nationwide, regardless of who gets elected. That's my bold prediction. But this is still true. And I'm so thankful for that.